What was supposed to be a launch event for a new chocolate product took a horrifying turn when the boss tried to cut into the massive confection. The saw got stuck, and a mysterious liquid started oozing out, followed by a putrid smell. Puzzled but curious, the boss kept sawing, only to have a decomposed corpse tumble out. Before long, Bones and her team arrived on the scene. Kneeling down, Bones examined the body, quickly determining the victim was female based on the hip bones, and around 30 years old due to early fusion in the spinal vertebrae. Camille inspected the body entombed in chocolate and realized the victim had been encased post-mortem during the decomposition process, which explained why the soft tissues had rapidly broken down into liquid. Booth soon arrived with the factory boss, Jimmy, and his engineer, Scott. Jimmy insisted he had overseen the entire chocolate pouring process and saw nothing. Scott added that the chocolate had been made starting Tuesday at 10 a.m. and didn't fully solidify until Thursday at 3 p.m., a 53-hour window. Jimmy had checked it every 8 hours and noticed nothing unusual. When Booth asked for security footage, Jimmy explained the giant chocolate was only cordoned off with temporary fencing and had no camera coverage. The team then transported the chocolate to the Jeffersonian. An intern discovered a depression in the victim's occipital bone. Bones theorized the killer had shoved her head against the mold while forcing her into the liquid chocolate. Seeking to determine the time of death, Bones wanted to examine the lungs, but Camille was struggling to locate them in the solidified mess. Meanwhile, another intern found cut marks on the victim's right radius, suggesting she had tried to fight off her attacker. Angela contacted Bones after reconstructing the victim's face, but there was no match in the missing persons database. Left with no other option, Booth and Bones brought the facial reconstruction photo to Jimmy. He immediately identified her as Harriet from R&D, with Scott as her direct supervisor. Scott, however, claimed he had sent Harriet to a cocoa bean conference in Maryland on Monday. The last time he saw her was at the Monday morning staff meeting. Booth asked Scott to list everyone who had access to the chocolate from Tuesday to Thursday. Scott doubted any employee would dump a body in the chocolate vat. Bones countered that there was no evidence Harriet was dumped after death. She suspected Harriet was thrown in alive. When Booth inquired about Harriet's family, Scott recalled she had a sister living in Virginia who might provide information. Back at the lab, Hodgins and an intern debated the best way to extract the skeleton without damaging evidence. The intern suggested a hairdryer, while Hodgins argued for a heat lamp to melt the chocolate evenly. Camille rushed in to stop them. Angela's 3D model revealed 2 air bubbles in front of the victim's face, possibly her last breaths. Melting the chocolate would destroy crucial evidence. Meanwhile, Booth tracked down Harriet's sister, Geneva, and asked if Harriet had any enemies at the chocolate factory. Geneva seemed surprised. She didn't know her sister worked there. When Booth showed her Harriet's resume, Geneva pointed out it was full of lies. The photo was accurate, but the work history was fabricated. A background check on Harriet's social security number revealed she changed jobs every few months, tailoring her resume to fit each employer's needs. For instance, when applying to an underwear company, she suddenly became a renowned lingerie expert. Sweets observed that someone who lies effortlessly in professional settings likely does the same in personal relationships, suggesting Booth look into her private life. Back at the lab, Camille carefully extracted the air bubbles with a syringe and handed them to Hodgins for analysis. While sifting through insects found in the chocolate, Hodgins looked for clues. Meanwhile, the skeleton was fully removed. Measurements confirmed that the bruising on Harriet's skull matched the edges of the chocolate mold, validating Bones' theory. Further examination of crushed cartilage in the diaphragm and stress fractures around the eye sockets confirmed Harriet was alive when submerged in the chocolate. The 2 air bubbles were her final breaths. Oddly, the damage to her radius wasn't recent. It was at least 5 to 6 months old. Despite signs of healing, the fracture hadn't been properly set. The intern speculated Harriet might have lacked access to proper medical care or ignored the injury. Booth investigated Harriet's previous employers and found she was universally popular, often seducing bosses or co-workers. Bones wondered if someone at Jimmy's factory had fallen for her. Booth checked her recent call logs, nothing unusual, but discovered she had filed a harassment complaint against a champagne factory boss 6 months ago. Before they could interview him, Camille called with results from the first air bubble, high carbon dioxide levels, confirming Harriet was buried alive. The bubble also contained traces of champagne, Bell'Uomo champagne to be exact, the brand produced by the factory they were about to visit. Lawrence, the champagne factory owner, was brought in for questioning. Presented with call logs showing he had repeatedly harassed Harriet, Lawrence admitted to a romantic relationship. He'd hired her a year ago, and they quickly became involved. But 6 months later, she dumped him. Around the same time, his distributor disappeared. He kept calling, hoping to win her back and find closure. Lawrence pointed a finger at Geneva, Harriet's sister. He dated Geneva first, then met Harriet while staying at Geneva's place. Harriet needed a job, her resume fit, and he hired her. When he left Geneva for Harriet, Geneva confronted him violently, nearly gouging out his eyes. If anyone had motive, it was her, he argued. Geneva was brought in for questioning. Booth asked why she hadn't mentioned her history with Lawrence. Geneva brushed it off as ancient history. Sure, she'd lost it when he left her, but she couldn't accept that her sister's fake persona had completely fooled him. Despite any resentment, they were still sisters. She'd never kill Harriet. Just as that lead went cold, the intern made a breakthrough. He found tiny abnormal growths at the end of Harriet's radial fracture. Bones identified them as typical signs of a foreign body cyst. When something gets stuck in an open wound, bone forms protective tissue around it. Hodgins analyzed the foreign material and identified it as residue from Helopeltis antonii, a tea mosquito bug found primarily in Indonesia, known for feeding on cocoa trees. Evidence suggested Harriet had visited Indonesia 6 months ago, likely a cocoa plantation. Booth discovered a company called Fresh Chocolate, which sent all employees to Indonesia for fieldwork. Interestingly, Harriet wasn't on their payroll. Given her pattern of leaving companies that later suffered losses, Booth suspected she was a corporate spy. Fresh Chocolate had probably planted her inside Jimmy's company to steal their new chocolate formula. Gail, the owner of Fresh Chocolate, was brought in. Booth laid out their findings, presenting evidence linking Harriet to her company. Facing at least 10 years in prison for industrial espionage, Gail finally confessed. She'd sent Harriet to Indonesia to pose as a regular industry worker. The old arm injury happened during harvesting on a remote farm. Lack of proper medical care led to infection and permanent bone damage. Upon returning, Harriet was placed undercover at Jimmy's. However, Gail revealed Harriet had secretly contacted her last week, whispering that she wanted out. Jimmy was getting suspicious. Gail warned her to be careful, given Jimmy's temper. Clearly, the warning hadn't helped. Just as suspicion shifted back to Jimmy, the intern found another clue: asymmetry in the fourth metacarpal joint of Harriet's left hand, indicating a recent forced dislocation. Booth and Bones rushed back to the factory, catching Jimmy in a rage, blaming the police investigation for ruining his business. Booth didn't hesitate and brought him in. In the interrogation room, Jimmy was stunned to learn Harriet was a spy. He demanded to see Scott immediately. Bones was confused. What did Scott have to do with it? As it turned out, Scott was the real chocolate mastermind. Jimmy was just a figurehead. Scott controlled all the recipes. With Scott's wife being emotionally distant, Harriet had targeted him to steal the formula. All evidence now pointed to Scott. Booth pulled Scott's credit card statements and found he'd signed up for a divorce website last week, bought a $12.99 bottle of Belluomo champagne the same day, and purchased an engagement ring. Bones connected the dots: the champagne in Harriet's air bubble and her dislocated finger. The pieces were falling into place, but they still lacked concrete evidence. Then Camille delivered good news. Analysis of the second air bubble revealed oxygen, carbon dioxide, and trace amounts of blood. Not Harriet's, but someone else's. Identifying that blood would lead them to the killer. Scott was brought in and confessed. When he discovered Harriet was a spy, he realized he'd been manipulated. She'd gotten the formula she wanted and dumped him after his divorce. Scott said Harriet had ruined his chocolate formula, so he poured her into it. And that wraps up today's story. If you have a movie you'd like to see or hear about, drop a comment below, click subscribe to watch more exciting content.